Yeah, one of the things we do talk about whenever we speak is just about lost civilizations.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned this before, how you were kind of a big fan of the Mayas and the Incas when you learn a lot about them. So how I've been thinking about that recently too, just because I think I might have watched the Graham Hancock podcast and I was like, man, this is like interesting. I went like a little bit of a deep dive on it.
Yeah.
Just trying to think about how it kind of relates to the knowledge that they had and how, we've lost so much of that and how kind of our civilization today is just based on the backs of the lack of knowledge that we had of about them. You've kind of had to figure a lot of stuff out about from the beginning. So the question I want to ask, just from the beginning, is that do you think all the knowledge that we had from the Incas and the Mayans, or the Norse knowledge, what role and what effect do you think that's had on us today? And first off, talk a little bit about the Mayas and the Incas from what you remember, some of the stuff that you knew about them, and then let's get into like what the lack of, what kind of the lost knowledge that they kind of they left behind and how that's affected our society.
Well, I mean, our actual perspective as a whole on their cultures has kind of been quite drastically affected by, how they're obviously cutting down a lot of the Amazon, which is a bad thing. But we're discovering a lot of these, like, actually incredibly advanced archaeological structures. To the point where, like, we've discovered cities that could easily have inhabited at least 250,000 people, if not more. We're talking upwards of, like, I think at one point it was hypothesized there could have been about 2 million people just living in the Amazon, which also ironically does directly coincide.
That's a lot of people.
That is a lot of people. But there is freakishly actually some Western historical evidence to suggest that that was definitely the case, and we treat it like it wasn't real for about 400 years.
As in it wasn't real, as in it didn't happen?
People didn't believe them, because the original Spanish explorers who went down the Amazon River spoke directly of how they saw, like, genuinely millions of people just in the forest doing their thing. And then obviously we didn't go back for 400 years, and then when we did, it was all gone. So we just immediately treated it as, that was bullshit, like El Dorado, which, the city of gold.
But that makes sense, though. Imagine someone saying this for millions of people in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, but it's not the middle of nowhere, though. It was somewhere to them, just not to us, because we didn't, it's this whole thing of, like, because we are also Western, we have a Western perception on history and the world, and, like, a lot of these ancient civilizations, even the ones that are kind of still hanging around us, like the Roman architecture, the Greek architecture, all this stuff, we see these things, but we feel a very clear level of disconnect to it. We're so disconnected from the past because at the end of the day, it's very difficult to imagine and relate to the struggles of somebody of that era if you don't actually have evidence of, well, what were you struggling through? Were you always just running away from Bengal tigers and shit? Or were you actually hanging out, sitting around thinking, like, damn, man, I need a better job?
What do you think this civilization was based upon? And this is complete conjecture. We have no idea about anything. But my question I'm asking basically is, what do you think? You know how we value religion and productivity and all these things? Do you think that's a core of human nature? And even these people who are kind of the Mayans or the Incas and the things that they were worshipping, do you think they had the same kind of idea about life and how to live your life as we do?
Well, I know that I can't remember the specific civilization that did this. It might have been all of them, to be fair. Ritual sacrifice was a big one.
Oh, of animals?
Of people.
To gods?
Yeah, to the gods. So, like, they'd, they've, like, in the cities that we've uncovered, they had these, like, really grand, like, complicated, what looked like little temples atop these, like, small things. You can see them if you just
like
Machu Picchu. So atop these, like, things, there are altars where, like, there was literally a pot where human hearts would go in after you cut them out. It was like a whole thing. They'd lift it up and be like, oh, like, God, give us, like, water and plants and stuff like that.
How out there do you think that idea is? Obviously, we know that's barbaric.
It's not out there at all, mate. What do you mean? Like, okay, hang on a minute. I understand what you're saying, and I get, obviously, there is a very large conceptual difference here. So just suspend your disbelief a little bit.
So disbelief suspended.
Cutting out somebody's heart and offering it up to a god versus taking bread and wine and, the Eucharist, and the man himself, the boy JC, directly goes, all right, cool, this is my body, this is my blood. have some of that shit.
Do this in remembrance of me.
Yeah, but same concept, because these people, it was an honor to be sacrificed in their societies. It was a genuine honor. I'm not going to debate whether or not they were afraid to die.
Yes.
Probably. But
I think they viewed death differently, but go on.
they probably did view the value of life and death differently as well. That's also a concept that we might never have a concept of, because, whatever they wrote down as well, by nature of the fact that it was in a very humid climate that was also in the jungle, so there's a lot of, continuously, like, churning biomass. Even if they did leave written records of stuff, if they carved it into wood, well, that rotted away. We don't have it anymore.
Yeah.
The conditions had to be quite special, actually, for a lot of civilizations to have remained at all throughout the 5, 6, 7,000 years since then that we are now. Like, even like ancient Mesopotamia, which was the very beginning of society as a concept, even that is, we're talking about like 12,000 years old. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that even in China, civilization could have started as early as 18,000 years ago, which is basically unfathomable in terms of time. Like, for context, 18,000 years ago, mammoths were still knocking about, like, across quite a lot of Europe. So that's a very long time.
That's a very long time.
Like,
see, I'm fascinated by these concepts.
How crazy is that?
It's crazy.
Like,
it's insane. I'm fascinated by these kind of history or these knowledge that we find as a result of the diggings up and the kind of like anthropology that we do, because it always strikes me as like we're looking into a different world. We're always talking about alternate universes, but like human beings in a different environment at a different time is an alternate universe.
Essentially,
it's just like the conditions and the things they know, and even like the knowledge they build and the things that they build upon the things they know. That sets them apart so much, because like you look at the Mayans or the Incas, right, for example, and you see the civilizations that they build, and you compare it to what we know about what we do today. It's so different that it's almost not even human. As in, like, you were just talking about the human sacrifices and stuff they make, right? You couldn't. Maybe you could right now, in a civilization somewhere, in the jungle, somewhere very, very far away from normal society, but you couldn't really see them and say that they have the same kind of view on life as we do. And that always struck me as interesting, because it was like, would we be the same if we were in their shoes? And it's like, okay, maybe.
Well, if we were in their shoes...
Would you also sacrifice human hearts to the god of light or fire or whatever the fuck, Like,
well, if that was my culture and I genuinely believed that my god would be happy if I did so, yeah. I don't think that I'd become this, like, psycho killer or anything like that, because it was a very heavily ritualized thing. Like, it was an extremely important religious thing for them.
So it was a ritual instead of just like a mass killing that they did.
Yeah, they saw it quite simply as like almost a necessity in order to perpetuate the kind of life that they were living, because in their mind it was only this nice because their gods had received their offerings and gone, right, cool, you guys get another 5 years, and then maybe I'll throw a big rock at you or something. But
here's a question. Sorry to interrupt. No. Here's a question, because I've kind of like crystallized the idea what I'm just trying to say and answer these questions. How different do you think, or how similar do you think our civilization today would be if they'd kept like written records that preserved throughout that time? Because like we build in knowledge, right, as a civilization, or do you think there's two ways, right? Do you think we would have kept building on the knowledge that they had, but that would have kept us constricted to that kind of the perspective they had as that society back then? Or do you think society kind of needs to destroy itself and rebuild itself in order to thrive?
Well, I think those are two very loaded questions.
I understand, But let's unpack them. Let's unpack the first one first.
Okay, so for the first one, I would say that no, I don't think it necessarily would have made much of a difference, on the basis that by the time that us Western folk had encountered them, the second that we became aware of the fact that their culture was like not capitalist, not at all concerned with the things that we thought were like civilization, we immediately turned around and went, okay, cool, guess I'll start killing.
But do you think we would have built our civilization, our capitalist one, without, like, if we knew theirs existed? Like, why wouldn't we just carry on what they had?
Well, there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that, for example, like even in Mesopotamia, there was a degree of geographical understanding in that they knew America was there. Because the Polynesian islands in the Pacific, like that all came about because people went from the Mediterranean into the Pacific all the way to the Polynesian islands, and presumably also kept going up into Latin America. what became Latin America. I mean.
Yes, yeah.
And in that sense, already we're talking like 6,000-7,000 years, culture and society had developed in a completely different conceptual way to how it was already developing in the West. So we were already so alien from one another.
They will develop on our own societies, like irrespective of each other.
Yeah, like don't get me wrong, they were still obviously an extremely advanced, societally complex place. Like they had a lot of they had social hierarchy. They had like commerce, economy, all that shit. Granted, it was in cocoa beans, but that's because to them, cocoa beans were...
That's what valuable to them.
Yeah, but cocoa beans were also seen as, like, if you drank, like, hot chocolate in, like, an Aztec society, for example, you were, like, of the rank of, like, a priest or higher. Like, you were a really important guy, because it showed, I'm so rich, I can literally eat and drink my money.
It's like Pablo Escobar burning money to keep your family...
Exactly. It was a big flex for them back in the day.
Yeah. Okay, and then there's the second part of that question.
Yeah.
Do you think we could have? Do you think? How do you think we build our society today with the lack of their knowledge? How do you think it's changed now that we don't know? Like this reality that we live in today, which is like the history that they had, all the stuff that happened in them, all the cultures, all the events. We kind of have vague memories or vague knowledge of that. We kind of had our society anyways. How do you think that reflects on us?
Our society appears, if we're talking about a purely colonialist way, I think that it essentially preyed on the idea that we had, in a very similar way to this idea of like manifest destiny. We, not just England, I mean like also every empire, so the Dutch, the Spanish, whoever the fuck.
Yeah.
They had a very much perspective of like, we are the advanced ones. You're primitive, so we can take advantage of this. And also, you have stuff that we want.
Yeah.
So we'll just fuck you over, make peace where it's necessary because it's convenient. Like, they're not just going to go to war for the sake of going to war. That's actually stupid from an economic standpoint. They even knew that, 500, 600 years ago. There has to be a real incentive to justify killing people, because why would you do that when you can either make peace and trade, or simply fucking enslave them? Like, that was always a very valid option back in the day, and it's something that, yes, it's a very uncomfortable thing to talk about now, but you have to look at, like, that in itself shows us how much societally we've already altered ourselves. Like, now, that was done in a time where human life was not really something worth respecting, or at least, if it wasn't your immediate human lives that you did care about, why should I respect it?
Yes.
Especially if they have stuff that I want and that I could sell, which, again, was a big incentive.
I feel like that's always been the case, though. That's still the case now.
No, of course. I mean, like, the oldest trade in the world outside of sex is slaves.
Slavery, yes.
Like, even if we're talking about, like, again, Mesopotamia, these, like, the countries that became, like, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, all these places. This was, like, the high seas of the Mediterranean and, like, where Mesopotamia really took off. Even there, slavery was abound. There was a very clear social hierarchy system which suggested a degree of fluidity as well. So the idea that you could go from being like bottom of the barrel and like they placed it. Actually, get this, society that's like 8,000 years old, and the thing that they prioritized above everything else, it seems, other than trade, slaves, sex, all that, bro, knowledge, scholarly activities, like Mesopotamia. So if you don't know, Mesopotamia basically, this is like a collection of several countries because it was quite a large empire for its time. What we also became aware of in the 1900s when these things called the cuneiform tablets were discovered. So cuneiform is a language. I don't know if it's a spoken language, but it specifically is definitely a written language. And that stems from actually two different... So in ancient Mesopotamia, the poor people wrote stuff down and spoke two languages. One of them was a language called Sumerian and the other one was Akkadian. So I believe Sumerian is the one that actually has absolutely no relatives to current languages. So that is a true dead language that we know of. I mean, there were obviously translations in cuneiform from Sumerian to Akkadian, and from Akkadian to Sumerian, but we've yet to sort of crack that code, I think. But even then, I might be talking about old information. I don't know. all of that is to say that what we found on these stone tablets from 8,000 years ago was, not this, like, crazy history or anything like that. It was actually a fucking story. So we found genuinely probably the oldest story ever conceived, which turns out to actually be the Epic of Gilgamesh. Go figure, innit?
Or you mean another perspective of Epic of Gilgamesh?
No, I mean literally the Epic of Gilgamesh is from the cuneiform tablets.
What is the Epic of Gilgamesh?
So the Epic of Gilgamesh is basically this story of like a king or a man who becomes king. And what it shows us very clearly, which is what I find so fascinating about it, is like even the first part of the story itself, it's literally called like the story of fear of death. It directly goes into this man and his psychological state and how he struggles so desperately with his fear of death and how he wants to be this like courageous, powerful, trustworthy man, but he's afraid to die when it counts. And that really weighs on him throughout the story, which also, like, is a weirdly nuanced and very fascinating way to explore. So, like, again, this is from tablets, clay tablets that are, like, this big, and that, you write on one side and you write on the other side. All of this is from, like, could be much more than 8,000 years. It was just the ones that we have are written down between 8,000 and 13,000 years old. So that's a very, very, very old
And also
story.
that makes you think, right? Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but I had so many thoughts when you were saying that.
Because it's crazy, isn't it?
It is crazy. Because it makes you think that, because we often think these older civilizations are primitive and they had no ideas of stories or like nuance, but I think they did. And I think human beings have always been the same because we're the same creatures. Yes, we might develop on types of knowledge. So the fact that we've had our knowledge kind of digitized and we've written it down has definitely helped us, because it feels like when you're born as a new kid, you have all these backlog of knowledge which you can learn easily, and you can you have so much advantage to what maybe they had to kind of relearn everything again themselves. But it also gives you the perspective like that. It's fascinating that why they put that story down, or even maybe that story wasn't even that important. It was just a story, part of thousands of other stories that they kept, and this is just one story that we've been able to keep. So I always find it interesting when we look at these societies, right? Because it's like we're basing what we know of them based on what we can find. The knowledge that we've been able to find based on our perspective of how smart we are is what we look at back at them and go, this is what they thought was important. But I never think that's the case, right? And this is another question that I had, right? I've been thinking about, like, why do you think, because all these civilizations, they must have grown and become massive, and you talk about Mesopotamia and how big that was, but then they lead to collapse. And it got me thinking about how progress in these civilizations often leads to collapse. And do you think that's a feature or a bug? Do you think every civilization that continues to progress will reach a point where it has to collapse because it becomes too complex, the systems kind of degrade on themselves? Or do you think every civilization, for instance, the dawn of time, has done something wrong for it to collapse? What do you line on that?
I think